So in this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how you would debug some simple JavaScript code using the Chrome developer tools. So you'll see how you can use the tools available to you to inspect the values of the code that's running on your page, and we'll have a simple project with some bugs that I've added in there, so we'll go through and see how you can solve those problems without having to go back to your project and adding console.logs to inspect the values that are actually inside of those variables. So we'll be doing this in Google Chrome, but the developer tools in other browsers are very similar, and I've got a sample project on GitHub which you can download and actually debug these problems yourself as well. So let's get started debugging JavaScript in the Chrome developer tools. Okay, so to do our debugging in JavaScript, we're going to be using this simple web app that I've put together. It's basically just like a logging page that's got some HTML with some inputs, and there are a couple of JS files that have a couple of functions which we'll be going through, which is causing some errors. So as always, you can get a copy of this code from the GitHub repository, and I'll put a link in the description below if you want to follow along. So if we head over to our browser, this is the web app running, and as you can see, there's some kind of problem because none of the content is displaying. So this is kind of a typical situation, especially if you're using a framework like React or Angular. If you're getting a blank screen when you're expecting to have some kind of page or web app being displayed, then you can be sure that there's something going wrong in the JavaScript. So the first thing you need to do is just head on over to the developer tools. So you can do that by inspecting the elements of the page, or using the keyboard shortcuts to do that. And you can see straight away that we've got an error appearing, and if we head on over to the console, we'll be able to see what that is. So in the console of the Chrome developer tools, we're seeing we've got an uncaught reference error, which is saying that there's a variable setp which is not defined. So this error message should be enough for us to go back into the code and find out where this setp variable is and why it's not defined. But we have got some additional information here. We've got a stack trace of where this error has occurred, and you can see that the error is occurring on app.js line 5. And we can actually click that link, which takes us to the sources tab in the Chrome developer tools. And the sources tab will show you all of the files, particularly the JavaScript files that are being used to render this page. And you can see over here on the left hand side, this mimics the folder structure that I've got in Visual Studio Code. And you can see I've got the app and login files here. So clicking on the link in the console took us to this page. So this was app.js on line 5. So here you can see the setp function being called, but you'll notice in the rest of this file there's no setp variable, which corresponds to the error that we were seeing in the console. But there is a function being defined called setup, and you can see the error now, so the setp should actually say setup instead of setp. So in this instance, I just made a typo in the script, so we can go back to the code and actually resolve that now. So back in Visual Studio Code, I'll head to the app.js file, and then just put the U in there to create setup. And if I save the file, and head back over to the browser, you can see the code that's in the browser in the app.js file has been updated, so we're now calling setup. And we're no longer getting any errors in the actual console. And what that function is doing in the app.js file, the setup function, it's actually selecting the main element on the page and then removing a hidden class. So obviously this isn't something you do in a real world application. A lot of the examples in this project are made up just for demonstration purposes, so you'd never really do this in a real application, but you can see how a simple error stopped the actual app from rendering. And using the console, we can jump to where that error is occurring, identify the problem, and then go back into our source code to fix it. So we've got some more useful tools on the right hand side here, and we're going to go through some more problems in this app, and we'll demonstrate some of these tools and how they work. So back in the code, if we look in the login.js file, we've got a validate form function which gets called when the login form is submitted, and it's very crude and obviously insecure, but it's basically checking for a username of Sarah and a password of let me in. So the idea being if we put those details into here, I've just put this as a text input so you can actually see what I'm typing in. So we've got Sarah and let me in. If we try and log in, even though we're expecting those details to work, we're getting this error message saying we've got incorrect login details. So there's obviously some kind of bug in our code, so we need to work out what's going on there. So you might up until now have been going back to the code and putting some console.logs to see what the values of each of these variables are and seeing why username and password don't match these conditions. But we're going to go back to Chrome to use its debugging tools to work out what's going wrong. So back in the sources tab, we'll go to the login.js file. And again, you can see we've got the code that's set up in that file, so we can actually look at it and inspect it from here as well. And the first thing that I would do here is I'd want to know why this if statement isn't actually firing, because this is the bit where the open app function is called. And you can see down here the open app function will basically just display some app details rather than the failure that we're seeing at the moment. So we can actually, just on the lines here, we can actually click and put a breakpoint to pause the execution of this JavaScript when we hit this line. So a breakpoint here is telling Chrome to stop when we actually reach this line of code, and you can see that in the right hand side here we've got a list of all the breakpoints that we've got set up, and we can set multiple ones here. So Chrome will pause each time it hits one of these lines. So we can actually just click the login button again. You can see we get this message saying the code is paused in the debugger, and if we head on over to the login.js file, you can see that our code has been paused at line 6. And we've got some more information in our tools in the right hand side here. So the first thing to note is you can actually hover over any variable that's been defined here, and as long as it's been assigned a value, you can actually see what that value is. So we can see in the if statement, the username that we're trying to check for is actually the form control itself, and we're trying to check whether that's equal to the string of Sarah. And the same thing for password, it's actually the form control, the actual input box from the HTML form, and we're trying to check if that is equal to the string of let me in. Now the problem here is when we've actually selected the elements, we haven't got the value of the input box, we've actually just selected the elements themselves. So we need to go back and change that in the code. But just before we go back and do that, we can actually go to the next breakpoint that we set on line 10 by clicking the button up here, which is to resume the script execution, which will release the debugger in Chrome, and then it will carry on until it hits another breakpoint. And this is useful because we can check if the code inside the else statement is being run. So if we click the button, you can see that we do go to the next breakpoint, and we are indeed removing the class to actually display this error message over here. So pressing the button one more time will release the debugger, and there's no more breakpoints and the code is finished. So we're now free to interact with the page again. So let's go back over to our text editor and actually update the code to make sure this works. So the solution here, we need to just put value on here and also value on here. So now instead of selecting just the element, we're actually getting the value inside it, which if we type the correct username and password should allow us to go to the next stage. So back in the browser, let's type in the username and password again. And I've still got my breakpoint set, so I'll click the login button again. And this time you can see that the value of username is actually Sarah, and the value of password is let me in. And one thing that's useful over here on the right hand side in our tools is the scope section. So you can see here that those values of username and password are actually set inside there as well. So we can use that as well to inspect the value of any elements in the local scope. And you can see that includes any other variables like the event variable, which is registered in the function, and also this, which is currently set to window. So now if we actually click the resume button, we're not expecting to hit this other breakpoint. The code inside of this if statement should run, so we should be expecting a console log and also to call this open app function. So let's resume execution now. So although we didn't hit the other breakpoint, we did actually get another error, and you can see that error appearing here. So we can see here that open app, the function that we're trying to call, is not defined. And this is due to the open app not being in scope. And if we just click the login button again, you can see here in our scope settings that the open app variable is not defined. The function can't be called from there because it doesn't exist. And one thing we can do with the additional tools we've got over here is actually step into the next function call. So instead of just going to the next breakpoint, we can actually go inside of this if statement and see what's happening in there. So if we step into there, our scope has changed to inside of the if statement here, but it doesn't include the open app function. So that's why we're getting this error, because it's not defined. And the reason for that is because I've done some bizarre coding down here. I've actually put the open app function, which should be in the global scope, into its own separate scope. So we need to remove these curly braces to make the open app function available to the rest of the code. So let's go back to Visual Studio and do that. So we'll just remove these curly braces here because they're causing a problem. And if we go back to our code, what we'll need to do is just resume our execution of our code so we can rerun the debugger again. And what I'm going to do now is actually set up the breakpoints again. I'll just set one on the if statement again, and I'll try logging in. So when the debugger pauses again, you can see we've got our scope here, but the actual open app function is hidden away somewhere in the global scope. So we could go around digging trying to find that, but we can use the watch expression section up here to type that variable in and to see what value it has. So we can just say open app. And you can see that expression is now appearing, and you can see the function that's going to be called. And you can see that's now appearing, and you can see the function that's going to be called. And you can actually type any type of JavaScript expression into here. So if we wanted to see what type of variable open app is, we could just say type of open app. And you can see the developer tools are telling us that it's going to be a function, which is all good because it means that when we call open app with our parentheses, the code will actually run. So let's resume execution in the developer tools. And now you can see we're getting a message saying we're successfully logged in and the code has finished running. So let's log in one more time, and don't forget we've still got that breakpoint set up. So when the debugger has paused execution of the code, we can actually head on over to the console. So if I just open up the console drawer here, and what we can do in here is actually type the name of any variables and inspect their values. So for example, if we want to see what username is, you can see it gives me back Sarah. Or we've got this other variable inside of our if statement here, which is user defaults. So I can actually type that in here. And I have this object which is defined elsewhere in the code, and I can inspect it and open it up and use the console to work with that variable and use any JavaScript code to actually work out what the problem with that variable might be. So one final thing that we'll do with our example app, I'm just going to clear this breakpoint and refresh the page, is demonstrate to you how DOM breakpoints work, and this is setting a breakpoint in the actual HTML. For example, when part of the web page changes and working out what part of the code has actually done that. So if we go onto our Elements tab, and let's open up Body, into the main, and you can see this failure element here is the one that shows when we've incorrectly logged in. So what we can actually do if we click on that element and then open up our menu, we can actually set a breakpoint here. And this breakpoint can be when the elements inside it are actually modified or whether a node is removed. But I'm going to set it when one of the attributes has been modified, because that will trigger when we remove this D_non class, which occurs when we get an unsuccessful login. If we scroll down here, we've got a DOM breakpoint section which lists the breakpoint that I've just created. And so this should trigger when I have an unsuccessful login. So let me say something like Sarah password, which obviously won't match the if statement. And if I click that now, you can see our debugger has paused the code once more, and it's taken us to the line in the code in the login script that is actually removing that class. So this is useful if you're not really sure what part of the code is actually causing a problem, but you can see part of the document object is being modified, and you can set a breakpoint there and it will take you to the code that is actually doing that modification. So that's how you use the Chrome debugging tools to actually debug your code directly in the browser. There's a lot more that you can do with the tools that you have here on the right hand side, and there's lots of useful information in there for you as well. But hopefully you've seen with this simple example how you can actually inspect the code that's running on the page, see what values are being set into certain variables, and then rather than using console.log to actually see what those values are, you can use the developer tools to actually inspect those values. So that's it for this tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials.